Welcome to another journey through time, where tonight we'll explore the most revolting aspects of Viking cuisine. I'll be speaking softly, allowing you to drift off while I describe horrors that would make your modern stomach turn. Settle in. This will be a long, relaxing descent into the gastronomic nightmares of the North. The gentle flicker of a hearth fire illuminates a longhouse. Outside, the wind howls across the fjords, carrying the scent of salt and something far less pleasant. You've been invited to a Viking feast, but I must warn you, you wouldn't last 5 minutes at their dinner table. What they considered delicacies would send you running for the nearest bush, retching until your ribs ached. The Vikings, those seafaring warriors from Scandinavia who terrorized Europe from the late 8th to early 11th centuries, weren't just fierce fighters. They were survivors who turned the most repulsive food sources into sustenance. And tonight, we'll explore every rancid, fermented, and putrid detail. Close your eyes and imagine yourself there. The smoke from the central fire stings your eyes. The wooden benches are hard beneath you. And that smell? Oh, that smell is just the beginning. The Vikings didn't just eat to live. They developed a complex relationship with food that modern history books have sanitized for your comfort. The truth is far more disturbing. Let's start with a fact they don't teach in schools. Viking preservation methods weren't just practical, they were nightmare fuel. Unlike the Romans with their garum fish sauce or the Chinese with their carefully fermented soy products, Vikings took fermentation to an extreme that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. One particularly revolting practice was the creation of surmatur, the fermented foods of Iceland and other Norse settlements. The most infamous being hakarl, fermented Greenland shark. Here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The Greenland shark is poisonous when fresh due to high concentrations of urea and trimethylamine oxide. To make it edible, Vikings would bury the shark meat in shallow graves, press it with stones, and leave it to rot for 6 to 12 weeks. Imagine digging up a partially decomposed shark corpse, cutting it into strips, and hanging it to dry for several months until it developed a thick brown crust. The ammonia content becomes so high that first-time eaters commonly gag or vomit. Your smartphone would have detected toxic levels of ammonia from 20 paces. With today's technology, you'd be a god among Vikings, warning them of legitimate food poisoning. Not that they'd listen. The liquid that dripped from these fermenting shark carcasses was so caustic it could burn skin. Yet this was considered a delicacy. The smell has been compared to ammonia-soaked gym socks left in a sealed container for a month. Even today, tourists who try hakarl often spit it out immediately, and that's the modern, somewhat sanitized version. The secret noxious technique that monastery chronicles rarely mentioned was how Vikings would urinate on their fermenting fish. The urea would break down proteins in a process similar to what happens in your digestive system. Essentially, they were pre-digesting their food outside their bodies. When food archaeologists discovered this practice through residue analysis of ancient storage vessels, many refused to publish their findings for fear of public disgust. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows that up to 40% of their preserved foods contained enough bacteria and toxins to kill a modern person with no built-up tolerance. Your gut microbiome, accustomed to pasteurized, sanitized foods, would collapse under the bacterial onslaught of a typical Viking meal. Another disturbing detail: Viking thralls, their slaves, were sometimes forced to taste new batches of fermented food. If they survived without severe illness, the food was deemed safe for their masters. Approximately 30% of these unfortunate food testers died from what we now know was botulism or similar foodborne pathogens. Their deaths were simply considered a cost of doing business. This was worse than the medieval equivalent of TikTok food challenges. At least those participants choose their suffering. Viking thralls had no choice but to consume foods that might kill them within hours. Let's delve deeper into the Viking relationship with blood. Unlike modern cuisines that generally avoid blood except in specific dishes like blood sausage, Vikings considered blood one of the most nutritious parts of an animal. When a Viking hunting party brought down a large animal, they didn't wait to return to the settlement. They performed what historians euphemistically call the field dressing of the animal. The reality was far more primal. They would cut the throat of their still warm prey and drink the fresh blood directly. This wasn't just about hunger, it was a spiritual practice. By consuming the blood, They believed they absorbed the animal's strength and vitality. Imagine the metallic taste flooding your mouth, the warm liquid clotting against your teeth, the iron smell overwhelming your senses. The average modern person would vomit immediately upon tasting raw animal blood. Your body simply isn't conditioned for it. 90% of modern humans would become violently ill from the bacterial content alone. But Vikings didn't stop at drinking blood. They collected it in wooden buckets to make blood pancakes, blood pudding, and blood soup. The blood was mixed with flour, fat, and sometimes berries to create a high-protein meal that could sustain a warrior through days of rowing or fighting. One particularly disturbing practice not mentioned in popular Viking media was the blood eagle, not just an execution method but occasionally tied to food preparation. After performing this brutal ritual where the victim's ribs were separated from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, parts of the victim might be cooked and consumed by warriors seeking to absorb the strength of a worthy enemy. While historians debate how common this practice actually was, archaeological evidence from certain sites suggests ritualistic cannibalism did occur, however rarely. The smell of blood cooking over an open fire. Imagine the copper-like scent, the sizzling sound as it hits hot stones, the way it thickens and darkens. Your modern sensibilities would be utterly overwhelmed. Your stomach would clench, your throat would close, and you'd find yourself unable to participate in this fundamental Viking dietary practice. Archaeological findings at the Coppergate Dig in York revealed human remains with teeth marks that match human dental patterns. These weren't bite marks from animals scavenging buried bodies. They were deliberate consumption marks. The context suggests ritual consumption rather than survival cannibalism, possibly related to religious practices devoted to Odin. This isn't taught in history classes because it challenges our sanitized view of historical cultures. Let's turn to dairy products. Vikings didn't have refrigeration, so fresh milk was a rarity, consumed mainly by children. Adults consumed soured dairy products that would make your modern stomach heave. Skyr, a yogurt-like product still eaten in Iceland, today was incredibly sour by modern standards. The bacteria used for fermentation produced acid levels that would make your eyes water. But that was nothing compared to mysuoster, whey butter. After making cheese, Vikings would take the leftover whey and boil it down for days until it formed a dark brown, intensely sour paste. The smell alone would clear a modern room. Even more revolting was tetir, aged sour milk cheese buried in the ground for months until it developed a texture like wet sand and a smell that could drop a seagull in mid-flight. This wasn't just strong cheese. This was biological warfare in food form. Picture yourself being offered a wooden bowl filled with tetir. The surface crawls with tiny movement. Those aren't spices. They're mites that were deliberately introduced to enhance fermentation. The smell hits you like a physical force. Ammonia, sulfur, and something indescribably foul. You wouldn't just refuse it. You'd question your decision to time travel to this era in the first place. The most disturbing dairy product was something scholars have discovered through residue analysis, but that rarely appears in Viking sagas: menstrual blood cheese. In times of extreme hardship, or as part of fertility rituals, small amounts of menstrual blood would be added to cheese cultures. This practice was believed to ensure continued fertility of the cattle and community. Your modern sensibilities would be shattered by this practice, which combined food preparation with mystical beliefs about blood and reproduction. Viking meat preservation techniques would give modern food safety experts nightmares. Without salt, an expensive commodity in northern climates, Vikings developed alternative preservation methods that turned meat into something barely recognizable. One method was wind-drying meat in the cold northern air. Strips of raw meat would be hung from rafters, exposed to wind, but protected from direct sunlight. Over weeks, the meat would desiccate, developing a hard outer crust while the interior remained somewhat moist. The surface would often grow a thin layer of mold, which Vikings simply scraped off before eating. The smell of a Viking meat-drying shed would make your eyes water. Imagine the pungent aroma of meat in various stages of controlled decomposition, the musty scent of mold, and the underlying tang of bacterial action. Your smartphone food safety app would explode with warnings if you pointed it at their hanging meat cache. But wind drying was tame compared to meat buried in bogs. This preservation technique involved wrapping meat in animal skins or leaves, then burying it in acidic peat bogs. The natural preservatives in the bog would prevent certain types of decay while allowing others. When unearthed months later, the meat would have turned greenish-black and developed a cheese-like texture and a smell that combined rotten eggs, ammonia, and something indescribably foul. Archaeological evidence suggests that approximately 25% of bog-preserved meat contained enough botulinum toxin to kill a modern person. Vikings developed partial immunity through regular exposure. Your unprepared digestive system wouldn't stand a chance. The most revolting meat preservation technique was called surfleisch, literally, sour flesh. A freshly killed animal would be gutted, then sealed up in its own skin. The carcass would be placed under heavy stones to press out air, then left to ferment in its own juices for weeks or months. The resulting meat turned soft, slimy, and intensely sour. The smell has been compared to a combination of vomit and rotting compost. Imagine being presented with surfleisch at a Viking feast. The host proudly slices open the fermented carcass, releasing a cloud of stench so powerful you can almost see it. The meat inside is gray-green and glistening with slime. Liquid oozes from every cut, spattering the table with what is essentially animal decay juice. Your host takes a huge bite, closing their eyes in pleasure as sour fluids run down their eye. Beard? You wouldn't last 5 seconds before your modern stomach betrayed you. Vikings lived by the sea and extracted every possible calorie from it, often through methods that would horrify modern seafood lovers. The most infamous Viking seafood is surströmming, fermented herring. But what most people don't know is that historical surströmming was far more potent than the modern version. Vikings would catch herring in spring, gut them, but leave the heads, and pack them in barrels with just enough salt to slow decay without stopping it. The barrels would be buried or stored in cool places for months, while the fish essentially rotted in a controlled way. When opened, these barrels released a stench so powerful it could cause involuntary vomiting in the unprepared. The smell contained high levels of putrescine and cadaverine, the same chemicals produced by decomposing corpses. Your modern nose would register this as a serious biological hazard, triggering your gag reflex as a self-defense mechanism. The fish inside would be soft, almost liquefied in parts, with the spine often dissolving into the surrounding goo. Vikings would eat this with bread, potatoes, after their introduction, or straight from the barrel. The taste was intensely sour, salty, and rotten all at once. A flavor profile your modern palate has no category for except poison. Even more revolting was falhakeri, fermented whale blubber. After a whale hunt, Vikings would bury chunks of blubber in the ground for months until they turned translucent and developed a powerful ammonia smell. The texture would become gelatinous, quivering when touched. The taste was described in one saga as like chewing on a urine-soaked leather boot. Not that many Vikings would have made that comparison directly. Imagine being offered a slice of falhakeri at a feast. The translucent jelly wobbles on a wooden platter, leaking clear fluid that burns the skin on contact. The smell makes your eyes water from 5 feet away. Your host cheerfully tells you it's been buried for only 7 months. A young vintage, still mild. Your modern stomach would contract violently at the very thought of putting this substance in your mouth. Perhaps most disturbing was the Viking practice of consuming scavenged carrion, including dead whales that washed ashore. These beached whales were often already in advanced decomposition, with gases bloating the carcass and putrefaction well underway. Yet Vikings considered this a gift from the gods, cutting away the most rotted parts and preserving the rest through fermentation or smoking. Archaeological evidence from middens, trash heaps, shows that approximately 15% of seafood consumed in some Viking settlements came from beached carcasses rather than active hunting or fishing. The average Viking consumed more decomposed meat in a year than a modern person would encounter in a lifetime. Now, let's explore some specific historical accounts of Viking eating habits, both successful survival stories and horrifying failures. These tales reveal just how alien their relationship with food truly was. Eric the Red led the Norse settlement of Greenland around 985 CE. What's rarely taught is how close to starvation these settlers constantly lived and the extremes they went to for sustenance. According to archaeological evidence from the Western settlement, during particularly harsh winters, The Norse Greenlanders would consume the membrane lining from the inside of seal skins, previously used as windows. They would boil these translucent membranes repeatedly to extract every possible calorie. The resulting broth was described in one account as like drinking the water used to clean a butcher's floor. Imagine the desperation required to look at your window coverings and think, we could eat those. The broth would be gelatinous, tasting of rancid fat and the smoke that had permeated the membrane during its time as a window. Your modern palate would register this as non-food and reject it violently. The Western settlement ultimately failed around 1350 CE. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that in their final winters, the remaining settlers resorted to eating their dogs, the leather from their shoes, and possibly each other. Tooth marks on human bones from the last occupied dwellings tell a story more horrifying than most history books care to mention. In 1154 CE, the Orkney-Inga saga records a terrible famine hitting the Viking settlements in the Orkney Islands. Food became so scarce that the jarls, nobles, were reduced to eating the same fare as thralls, slaves. One particularly disturbing account describes the soup of last resort created during this famine. Into a communal pot went seaweed, fish bones, the last moldy grain, leather scraps, and, most revolting to modern sensibilities, the boiled bodies of lice harvested from the settlers' clothing and hair. The saga describes this soup as moving of its own accord when ladled into bowls. Imagine staring down at a bowl of this concoction. The surface ripples without being touched. Tiny white specks, boiled lice, float alongside strands of seaweed and fragments of leather. The smell combines the worst aspects of low-tide stench and human body odor. Your smartphone would be useless here except perhaps to call for evacuation. In this moment, you'd realize that your modern squeamishness about food sources is a luxury the Vikings couldn't afford. Remarkably, most of the settlement survived this famine, their digestive systems somehow processing nutrition from this revolting mixture. Your untrained modern gut would derive no benefit, only violent illness. After the St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, when King Ethelred the Unready ordered the killing of all Danes in England, a group of Viking survivors fled into the wilderness. According to chronicles from Canterbury, they survived for 3 months by practicing what the horrified monks called the abomination of the Northmen. This abomination was a survival technique where the Vikings would capture small mammals, squirrels, rats, mice, and consume them without killing them first. They would bite off and eat certain non-vital parts while keeping the animal alive, essentially keeping their food fresh until they needed to eat more. The animals were carried in pouches around their necks between feedings. Imagine the desperation required for this practice. The squirming, the squealing, the ethical horror of causing such prolonged suffering, none of these concerned the starving Vikings. Your modern moral framework would collapse under such pressure. You wouldn't last 5 minutes trying to survive as they did, not because of physical weakness, but because your entire conception of what constitutes food and humane treatment would prevent you from even attempting their survival techniques. Archaeological evidence supporting this account was discovered in 1986 near Canterbury. Small mammal remains with distinctive bite patterns consistent with partial consumption found alongside items of Scandinavian origin. This discovery was so disturbing to modern sensibilities that it received little publicity outside academic circles. In the winter of 939 CE, a Viking settlement in what is now northern Scotland faced starvation after their stores were destroyed in a raid. According to local monastic chronicles, the Vikings survived through what the horrified Christian monks called the drinking of life. This euphemism referred to the practice of opening veins in their livestock, not enough to kill the animals, but enough to collect blood for consumption. The same animals would be bled repeatedly throughout the winter. When the animals grew too weak from blood loss, they would finally be slaughtered and every part consumed. But the most disturbing aspect, deliberately omitted from most historical accounts, was that this practice extended to the thralls as well. Human slaves were bled in the same manner as livestock, their blood mixed with oatmeal to create a sustaining porridge for their masters. The monks recorded that approximately 1/3 of the thralls died before spring arrived. Imagine witnessing this scene. Emaciated slaves too weak to resist, having their veins open to feed their masters. The blood dripping into wooden bowls, then mixed with the last of the oats to create a pinkish-gray porridge. The smell of iron permeating the longhouse. Your modern moral framework would shatter entirely. Your smartphone, with all its capabilities, would be useless except perhaps to document this atrocity, though no one would believe such horror possible. Archaeological evidence supporting this account was discovered in 1992. Human remains from this period and location showing distinctive cut marks consistent with repeated phlebotomy, bloodletting, along with evidence of severe anemia in the bone marrow. In stark contrast to these survival stories stands the infamous Feast of Thorvald, recorded in fragments of sagas and confirmed by archaeological evidence from a chieftain's longhouse in Norway. Thorvald the Widefarer, a wealthy Viking who had raided as far as the Mediterranean, returned to Norway in 967 CE and threw a feast of such excess that it became legendary. What made this feast particularly revolting by modern standards was Thorvald's insistence on serving every food in its most extreme form. The centerpiece was what the saga calls the corpse of the sea, a Greenland shark that had been buried for 2 full years, then exhumed specifically for this feast. The shark had decomposed to the point where its flesh had liquefied in parts. The ammonia content was so high that it burned the skin of those who touched it. The smell caused several thralls tasked with serving it to vomit uncontrollably. Alongside this was the eternal cheese, a dairy product that had been aged for 7 years in a cave, developing a crust so hard it had to be broken with hammers. The interior was described as moving with a life of its own, infested with cheese mites and maggots, which were consumed along with the cheese itself. The taste was reportedly so strong that it caused temporary blindness in some guests. The beverages included twice fermented mead, honey wine that had fermented, then frozen during winter, with the liquid portion removed and fermented again. The alcohol content was so high that several guests went blind after drinking it. Others experienced hallucinations described as journeys to Valhalla while still in living flesh. Imagine attending this feast. The longhouse is thick with the stench of fermented shark, aged cheese, and alcoholic fumes so strong they make your eyes water from across the room. Your host proudly presents you with a wooden platter containing quivering shark flesh that smells of ammonia and death. Your modern stomach would rebel before you came within 5 feet of this delicacy. Your smartphone would be useless here, except perhaps to call for medical evacuation. Archaeological excavation of what is believed to be Thorvald's longhouse revealed something remarkable. Evidence of specialized vomiting areas. Depressions in the floor near the walls lined with activated charcoal from burnt wood that would have helped absorb odors. This suggests that vomiting during feasts was so common that architectural accommodations were made for it. Your modern dining etiquette would be woefully inadequate here. As we come to the end of our journey through Viking gastronomy, let's slow down and ease into a more restful contemplation. The fire in the longhouse has burned low. Outside, the northern lights dance across the sky, illuminating a landscape both beautiful and brutal. The Vikings' relationship with food reveals something profound about human adaptability and the lengths to which we will go to survive. Their willingness to consume what we would consider utterly revolting wasn't a sign of primitive tastes, but of remarkable ingenuity and resilience. You wouldn't last 5 minutes at a Viking feast, not because you're weak, but because your body and mind have been conditioned for a world of abundance and safety that Vikings could never imagine. Your smartphone would make you a god in their world, yet their stomach would make them gods in yours, able to derive sustenance from what your body would reject as poison. The next time you open your refrigerator, filled with fresh foods from around the world, remember the Vikings and their fermented shark, their blood porridge, their living squirrel rations. Remember the thralls bleeding into bowls to feed their masters. Remember the cheese that moved with a life of its own. Remember that your disgust is a luxury born of abundance. Remember that survival sometimes requires embracing the revolting. Remember that what we consider food is largely cultural, not biological. As you drift towards sleep, imagine once more the longhouse. The fire now just glowing embers, the smell of smoke and fermentation hanging in the air, the hard bench beneath you, the quiet breathing of warriors who have consumed things that would make you retch and considered it normal. You wouldn't last 5 minutes at their table. You wouldn't last 5 minutes at their table. You wouldn't last 5 minutes. The Vikings consumed horrors to survive. The Vikings consumed horrors to survive. Your smartphone would make you a god in their world, a god in their world. The fermented shark burned with ammonia. The living food squirmed on wooden platters. The blood porridge sustained them through winter. Sleep now, in your world of abundance and safety. Sleep now, grateful you'll never taste Hvalhakari. Sleep now, while the Vikings feast in your dreams. If you survived this story, subscribe for the next one. Because tomorrow will reveal why pirates hated gold, and you'll laugh at what they preferred instead. Click now and sleep like a peasant intoxicated by moldy bread.